This is Flare Engine. Welcome. In this tutorial we're going to look into firearms and projectiles. Okay, let's begin. I duplicated Demo 1 to have a foundation to work with. You can do the same. In order to shoot stuff, the player requires a firearm, and that firearm requires a projectile. We'll first set up a firearm. We create an empty game object and make it a child of the player. As soon as the firearm becomes a child of the player or AI, the firearm will automatically register itself to that character. This happens at runtime. We'll add a sprite to the weapon. Note, this is optional. We name it. Besides the projectile, the most important part of the firearm is the fire point. This is the point where the projectile will spawn from. We create another empty game object, set it as a child of the firearm, and choose the location of the fire point. We then set its reference. We choose the fire button and trigger. Next, we set the local position. This is the position the weapon will have relative to the player at runtime. Off near a wall simply means the weapon will not be able to fire if the weapon is going into a wall. We'll leave it as is. We will quickly set up a basic projectile to test the firearm. We create another empty game object. This object must exist outside the player and weapon. It's important that the bullets aren't children of parent objects that can move, or it will interfere with the projectile's trajectory. In order to see all the options available, we must first create the bullet. We create another empty game object, set it as a child of the projectile, and add a sprite renderer. Now, the property options are visible. For now, we will set the ammo to infinite and leave the default settings. But we will set the layer. We set it to world, platform, and enemy, so the bullet can collide with these layers. We set this reference to the default projectile of the firearm. We leave the other settings alone and go into play mode to test this out. Okay, everything seemed to work. Okay, let's now focus on rotating the weapon. As you have seen, the default settings is to rotate with the mouse. That means the weapon will rotate to the mouse's direction. There are a couple of things to look at here. Mouse implements a top limit and bottom limit. When they are both 0, it basically means the mouse can rotate freely using all 360 degrees. If one of these is not 0, the mouse is now clamped. Each limit covers 180 degrees range of motion. We'll go into play mode to look at this. Full range of motion with no clamping. If we change the top limit to 180, the weapon will rotate within that range, and since the bottom limit is 0, we can't rotate downward. Now we change it to 90. And we can set the bottom limit to -45. And if the player changes direction, these limits will be respected. The angle offset will offset the rotation by the specified amount. Use this if the sprite direction of your weapon needs to be corrected. Typically, all your sprites should be made facing to the right, and all your weapons should have their sprite pivots set to the left. Most of the time, you want this value to be 0. Now we look at point towards. This is relevant to most rotation types. This tells the weapon what direction to point towards. Most of the time, you'll simply leave it at the first setting, which is the player's direction. The last type will be deprecated, so no need to worry about that one. We'll look at mouse direction in play mode, as I do want to point something out. If we leave it at character direction, the player and weapon can be facing opposite directions. We can fix this by setting it to mouse direction. Now the player and weapons are always pointing towards the mouse. However, we will need to modify Sprite Engine. Since we are using the demo, this is already set up, so we will simply look at the part you need to modify if you want to do it from scratch. We go into Sprite Engine. When mouse direction is active, the signals mouse direction left and mouse direction right will go active. So we enable these signals. Then we use them as such. You can of course play a reverse running animation if you have one. Now we explore the other rotation types. We will use 8-direction weapon pointing. We set the inputs. We go into play mode. If we enable diagonal, it will be able to utilize all 8 directions. Fixed angle will maintain the angle of the weapon static, and will mirror it according to direction. Fixed direction will keep the direction of the weapon completely fixed. It's important to note that AI can use weapons as well, and they have practically the same setup as a player. And finally, autoseek. This will always search for a set of targets on the target layer with a specified radius and search rate. The weapon will move automatically, and if you enable auto shoot, it will shoot automatically. We go ahead and change the projectile rate so the weapon doesn't shoot every frame. Autoseek is a cool feature if you want your weapon to act independently. Okay, that's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.